Hi, welcome to lecture number 25. Today we're talking about politics and regional interest. In the early part of period 4 in the early 1800s, the theme we're looking at today is politics and power. We have one learning objective today, is to explain how different regional interests affected debates about the role of the federal government in the early republic. All right, so we're going to begin with these regional interests. They often trumped national concerns as the basis for many political leaders' position on slavery and economic policy. All right, so regional interest, we're talking about the Northeast, the middle colony or the middle states, or the Southeast, or even the Western region. Those are the regions that we're really focusing on. We're going to begin with economic policy. The first economic policy that caused division amongst the regions was the tariffs. Now, tariffs in the time of Alexander Hamilton were being used to raise revenue for the federal government. Now, in 1816, we are using tariffs for the express purpose of protecting domestic industries. Regions with manufacturing are going to benefit, and revenue can be used to create infrastructure, roads, canals for settlements out west. Now, the first tariff of 1816 actually had broad support, even from the South, which was a region that doesn't necessarily benefit from having a tariff because it makes goods more expensive for them. But because of the nationalism that was left over from the War of 1812, this was seen as an anti-British move, and so that's why people in the South would have supported it. In terms of land in economic policy, the people in the West, they wanted the land to obviously be cheaper so that they could have more land out there. They criticized the Bank of the United States because the Bank of the United States had been a primary lender for some of these land purchases, and at the end of the 1810s, they began to tighten up credit. That means that they're not lending as much money, they're calling in some of the loans that they've given out, and then that's going to lead to a financial panic. So it's a panic of 1819. Speculation, which is buying land in hopes that it's going to sell for a higher price, becomes rampant out in the West, and the people who lived out west preferred using local or state banks because they were more willing to lend money than was the Bank of the United States. All right, slavery is the other big issue that divided the region. So supported in the South and the Southwest, the Southerners begin to migrate. The soil in the East was starting to become exhausted from poor farming practices over 2 centuries now. The Northeast and the Northwest had little use for it. As you remember, the Northwest Ordinance had already outlawed slavery in the new Western territories, the Northwestern Territory. And it's not going to be a issue that's going to divide political parties, or it's going to divide evenly or neatly between political parties. The Federalist Party, who was located mostly in the northeast section, they're starting to wane, they're starting to die away, especially after the War of 1812. And Democratic Republicans across the country are going to have a variety of views on slavery. Those who live in the South will support it, those who live in the North will oppose it. The next key concept here is plans to further unify the U.S. economy, such as the American system, generated debates over whether such policies would benefit agriculture or industry, potentially favoring different sections of the country. All right, so Henry Clay is the person who you have to associate with the American system. Henry Clay is going to be very important in the first half of the 1800s. He's going to be involved in a lot of very big political events. At this point, he is in the House of Representatives. He will be the Speaker of the House. And he's putting forth this new economic program that has 3 steps. The first one is to implement tariffs that are going to protect industries. So the revenue from the tariffs are eventually going to be used for the 3rd step, the internal improvements. The second step is to have a Bank of the United States that's going to be able to lend money to businesses and manufacturers to help extend the economy. This was already present. The Second Bank of the United States had been chartered in 1816. Despite the panic of 1819, by the 1820s, the bank was a reliable financial institution. And then the last one is internal improvements. This means infrastructure. Anytime that you see the words internal improvements in the 19th century, they're talking about infrastructure, or what we normally think of as infrastructure. That's roads, other forms of transportation. At this time period, it's canals, very early parts of railroads. And anytime that a bill would come up in Congress for internal improvements, it regularly lost, or whenever it was passed, it would be vetoed by the president. So an example of that is the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was vetoed in the House of Representatives, or it was after it was passed in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and so it had to be paid by the state of New York. This is still a ideological issue between Democratic Republicans and Federalists. Democratic Republicans do not view the federal government's role as being one that's going to create these internal improvements or forms of infrastructure. So the agricultural regions had less to gain, and so they are opposing Clay's American system. And on the bottom right, you see a political cartoon criticizing Clay's American system and showing each part of his system as being caged animals stealing food from each other. All right, and the last key concept that we're talking about relates to slavery. Congressional attempts at political compromise, such as the Missouri Compromise, only temporarily stemmed growing tensions between opponents and defenders of slavery. So the Missouri Territory applies for statehood in 1820, and it's going to be setting a precedent for how the rest of the Louisiana Territory is going to be admitted into the Union. And so in its application for statehood, in the act of Congress that was going to make it a state, Benjamin Tallmadge adds an amendment to that law that says that in the state of Missouri, slavery will not be allowed. And so it creates this sectionalism. It puts sectionalism on display. The southern states and the southern representatives go up in arms, and then the northern representatives are trying to support this anti-slavery measure in Missouri statehood. So here's Henry Clay again, a very important figure in the early 1800s. He steps in and brokers a compromise between the two sides. Missouri is admitted as a slave state, and then Maine gets carved out of some New England territory, and that's admitted as a free state. And then it's going to set the precedent that slavery will not be allowed in the western states above the 36-degree and 30-minute line of latitude. So you see it here on the slide that the only territory that's left below it is the Arkansas Territory and Louisiana. Later on, the United States will expand to the rest of the Southwest, and slavery will be allowed in those regions of the Southwest. But the Missouri Compromise is important because it leaves the balance even between slave states and free states in the Congress. All right, here's our recap. We see sectionalism growing over slavery and economic disputes, tariffs, land, and the Bank of the United States. Henry Clay's American system meant to help develop the U.S. faster, but it's not implemented fully. And the Missouri Compromise temporarily silences discord over the expansion of slavery. All right, that is it for this lecture. Please be sure to come back and watch the next one, in which we will talk about America on the world stage.